I'm delighted to say is being given by Barry Bergdoll, who's probably well known to many people in the audience, but those who don't know Barry or his work, he studied at Columbia University and at Cambridge University in England, and he came back to Columbia as a professor with considerable range in his interests in 18th and 19th century French and especially German architecture. He's published a great deal on Schinkel and on the tradition of German neoclassicism. And then, to me at least, rather suddenly, he leapt into the 20th century with an exhibition on Mies in Berlin, which was held both in the Museum of Modern Art and indeed in the Altes Museum in Berlin. Barry then moved sideways again to become the Philip Johnson Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why we're so pleased to have him sum up today's proceedings, because he was the chief curator of the exhibition held in MoMA in 2009, marking the 90th anniversary of the Bauhaus. Barry has since moved back to Columbia as the Meyer Shapiro Professor of Architectural History, and he's given many prestigious lectures, including the Slade Lectures in Cambridge. I should point out, in the wake of other historians, critics, and cultural luminaries as John Ruskin, Roger Fry, Rudolf Wittkower, and Ernst Gombrich. After that procession, I'm delighted to introduce Barry Bergdoll, who's going to take us back over the exhibition history of the Bauhaus and project us on into how the Bauhaus has been enshrined as such a beloved institution in the Anglophone world. Please welcome Barry Bergdoll.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for the invitation. Now you can be sure it will be a total letdown after that warm-up. And in fact, you said it's the last paper I have, mea culpa. I don't have a paper at all. I have a PowerPoint with lots of images, lots of questions, and I hope it will segue into an interesting discussion. And the honest reason why I have only a PowerPoint instead of a paper is I've just come back from the Bauhauses, and therefore was pressed for time. The other reason is because I'm at the end of the day, so I'm in the position summed up perhaps best by that great German comic, Karl Valentin, who said everything has already been said, but not by everybody. So it is now my turn to repeat what others have said so much more preparedly and elegantly. But I was very struck by your paper, Paul, and once again, Libby already heard me do this number in Aspen a few weeks ago. You go to a conference, and by the end, you wish you'd prepared a different paper than the one that you've been assigned, because very interesting questions arise. And I think it would be so interesting to try to situate so many of the panoply of activities of the Bauhaus and its influence and legacy in the dense context of other schools. So since in the end the Bauhaus was a school, and that is perhaps some of the work that remains to be done. But to my topic, which is the Bauhaus's legend-making exhibitions, I have been racking my brain through the whole day today to think if I could think, particularly egged on by you, if there was another educational institution that had such a legacy of exhibitions, not only of making them on their own, but of subsequent recording of them. So that we have the great irony that we were told last night in the wonderful keynote by Paul Betts about the history being about the only thing that wasn't taught at the Bauhaus, that the Bauhaus is under an enormous mountain of history in which we are, again, participating this afternoon. So I want to look at a little bit of the construct of that mountain through exhibitions. I'm going to peel back from the present and move up, because the Bauhaus itself began to construct these legends, these very, very diverse legends, and then I will move back towards the present. The only thing that I have written other than notes is the note to myself about what I was going to do. So I'll read this to you. You can tell me honestly at the end if I've done anything like it. From the first, the Bauhaus was as much a radically experimental art and design school as it was a means for promulgating ideas about modernism and design far beyond the provincial German cities of Weimar and Dessau. Dessau would have been horrified with that characterization when it was in its industrial heyday, but in any case, where the school made its home for all but the final year of its short existence. This is a school that did not even reach voting age. The school lasted but 14 years before it was closed under pressure from the National Socialist government that came to definitive power in 1933. But long before that, its unusual name, which Dietrich Neumann has just discovered was actually cribbed from an enterprise in Berlin that was using it as early as 1912. But in any case, he had to find that out. But long before its unusual name had become synonymous with modernist design, the result of the Bauhaus's creative use of publications and exhibitions to broadcast its philosophy and to amplify its achievements was well established. Already, and this is what we're going to do, in the great exhibition staged in Weimar in 1923, the school not only showed off student work, but harnessed a panorama of European modernism, particularly associating the work of architects from the Netherlands to even the United States with the work of the students and the masters. Reality and myth began to fuse in the perception of the Bauhaus, even during its own lifetime, where in fact, no architectural instruction was offered until the school moved to Dessau a few years later. So this lecture, I'm going to look at the difficult task that we continue to have of distinguishing the Bauhaus as a school from the Bauhaus as a propaganda machine, or a kind of lodestone magnet that attracts everything to it. A project I don't know, maybe it's been done because probably the Bauhaus literature is one of the few things that exceeds the Gesamtausgabe of Goethe as a kind of literary output that no one could master. And as I said, some of my students are here in the room, and I keep saying to them in response to various themes, I can't tell you that no one has ever written on it, because as soon as I say they haven't, you're going to find an article. But I would love to see a kind of etymology and genealogy of the word Bauhaus architecture. I don't know when that begins to appear. We can talk about that. Maybe someone here does. But likewise, all of the places in which the noun Bauhaus became an adjective would be, I think, an extremely interesting thing to think about. So here we are in the centennial year and in the closing comments. And of course, the question has already been raised, and I think we need to discuss it in the panel, about whether centennials or anniversaries tend to deepen understanding or solidify myths. I think that's also already been said. So here we are in the centennial, and I bring you a birthday cake in which one has to imagine the extraordinary scene in 1963 for Walter Gropius's 80th birthday at the Graduate School of Design in Harvard, where the invitees literally ate the Bauhaus. But we don't have a picture of the consumption taking place, only the cake that was offered, stolen from the absolutely wonderful website developed by the Harvard Art Museums. That, along with the 100-Year Bauhaus website, are wonderful new resources. A very small selection of the exhibition posters. How do you design an exhibition poster for the Bauhaus without cribbing? Either you crib or you defy. But just a very small sampling of literally the hundreds of things that have gone on and are still going on this year. I have obtained books on the Bauhaus in Czechoslovakia, the Bauhaus in Norway, the Bauhaus in the Netherlands. Happily, the Bauhaus in the Netherlands has a two-way arrow there, because I think one could argue that there was a much greater impact on the Bauhaus from the Netherlands than anything that the Bauhaus ever did affecting work in the Netherlands. But this is the year to embrace the extent to which your life has been determined by the Bauhaus. So it is also the year which sees, we might say, here's something that we can discuss, the kind of dialectic tension between forces of essentialization of what was the Bauhaus and the inevitable forces of fragmentation of Bauhauses. And so this continues to this day because every site that the Bauhaus occupied, and from which ultimately it was chased 3 times by the rise of right-wing politics, Weimar and Dessau, whose museums have opened over the course of the last 6 months, and below the projected extension for the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin, which will return, and the poster for its current extraordinary exhibition, Original Bauhaus. So what does this mean that 3 different cities in Germany, all of whom in fact hounded the Bauhaus out of their borders, have become centers for collecting and scholarship and interpreting, and most importantly, for what I want to talk about, of exhibiting. So we have right now, if you were to travel to Germany, as I did last week, and as I will again in 2 weeks with some of my students who are here in the room, the 3 different interpretations of the Bauhaus offered within under 200 miles, one from another. We also have this absolutely extraordinary new book that I tried to digest on the plane in order to redo this PowerPoint, not yet successful, a completely incomplete 400-page anthology of Bauhaus exhibitions, 1923 to 2019, and there juxtaposed with a view of the installation work when it was underway in the new Bauhaus Museum in Dessau. So are we somehow capturing a working current definition of the Bauhaus, or are we in fact witnessing yet further splintering? So at the risk of a little self-promotion, but this is about self-promotion, this lecture, I just show you a few images of the Bauhaus exhibition that was referenced by Paul a few minutes ago, that I co-curated with Leah Dickerman, and Derek Kiesa, who's here also, worked on it in the, now what is the old MoMA, 2009, so the 90th anniversary of the Bauhaus, which happened also to be the 80th anniversary of the founding of MoMA, since Alfred Barr, who's a long and studious life, said that he regarded the 3 days that he had spent at the Dessau Bauhaus in 1927, I believe, as the 3 most important days of his artistic education, and thought that the Museum of Modern Art was in some ways modeled on the model of the Bauhaus. So the idea also that a museum would be modeled on a school of art is also a very interesting thing. But I don't want to go into a rehearsal of this exhibition per se, but simply to say the reason that I put it at the beginning rather than at the end is what Leah Dickerman and I tried to do in that exhibition was to say we are only going to show things that were produced at the Bauhaus by people when they were at the Bauhaus. So no Mies van der Rohe before 1930, no Walter Gropius after 1928. There were a couple of cheats. Anybody who has a good memory will know. But the idea was not so much to narrate a new story, but to put together all of the things that had been produced there without a prejudice of one period over another, and to allow the visitor moving through to try to come to some sense of meaning of what was going on in this place that I think by its very nature was continually changing. And there was some call out a little earlier to use the word experimental, and I think indeed the experimentalness of it all was what we wanted to display there. From shocking people with a room of immersion into the very early years in the Weimar Bauhaus with the famous refound African chair of Marcel Breuer and Günter Stölzel there, and then moving on to what people would expect the Bauhaus to be, but not allowing that to grow to push everything else out of the gallery space, quite literally, here with Breuer furniture and Albers glass and graphic design that we've already seen, and then a contrast that Dara has already made for us, moving on to kind of Volksbedarf with Hannes Meyer, 2-year but extremely productive and completely reinterpretation of the Bauhaus mission. And then I suppose one of the only things we didn't get around to today in the history of the Bauhaus, and over again it is rather pushed to the side, is Mies's Bauhaus, in which the Bauhaus actually became something of an architectural school. And one could argue that if Mies had not begun to renounce almost immediately after arriving in the United States, his connection with the Bauhaus. Those 3 years under Mies, which produced many of the people who came to this country, would be looked at much more considerably as a very important and productive constituent part of the Bauhaus. So we're missing the Miesian years in our panorama of today, but that is where we ended, and with some of this furniture and architectural drawings produced under Mies. And then lastly, the one exception that we made, because of course it is one of the Mona Lisas of the MoMA collection, was the Schlemmer Bauhaus Treppe, which in fact, if I get to that slide, I will remind you, was not painted by Schlemmer when he was at the Bauhaus. In fact, was not painted in Dessau at all, and was painted after the Dessau Bauhaus had closed. So it is a kind of memento mori. It is actually not a recording of daily life per se. At the Dessau Bauhaus, we allowed ourselves that one exception. This appeared in the Frankfurter Allgemeine just the other day by the director of the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. So needless to say, as a place that is holding the legacy of Ernst May and the whole great modernist enterprise in housing, and we heard something about that with the Städel School, with Paul trying to put a pin into the balloon of the Bauhaus's reputation, but in certain ways simply echoing something that Meyer said later in life, which is, what did I discover at the time of my appointment? A Bauhaus whose reputation exceeded its achievements many times over, and within which an unparalleled self-promotion was promoted. So this is not, in every case, a new situation. So, indeed, if I start with an exhibitions that are on currently, and one that I was in part responsible for 10 years ago, the fact of the matter is that the Bauhaus began to construct some of these myths that we still struggle to deal with to this day. And I'm even struck by the paradoxical situation that we are in here today, because, of course, we gather together to deconstruct this myth all the time that we have devoted a day and a half to once again talking about the Bauhaus. So every time the Bauhaus is a little bit contextualized, it's also at the same time pairwise. So I'm very interested in particular in architecture. So as I mentioned to you, well-known fact, the architecture department is finally set up only in 1927, so 8 years into, more than halfway into the existence of the Bauhaus, yet architecture played obviously a key role in the name and the conception, the curricular diagram of the Bauhaus, but most particularly in this enormous sprawling exhibition staged in late summer 1923. We've already seen the poster and Herbert Bayer's design of the cover of the catalog. And many people know the postcards that were sent out. So this, I think, also is significant. The use of the postcard, not only a multitude of posters which would appear in various cities in the public street and which accompanied your walk from the train station in Weimar to the Bauhaus School itself, which was on the opposite side of town, still is, but also this ability to send out postcards, to send out pieces. It's beginning kind of a mail art in a certain way. There's, I think, 14 postcards altogether, one of which was actually a map of the town. And it reminds us that the Bauhaus was not trying to hide, as they claim everybody from Henry to Nietzsche, to Giron, to Goethe, to Schiller, along to Klein, etc., that the Bauhaus was not trying, in fact, to eradicate its position in this little city of Weimar, its relationship to 18th century philosophy, literature, natural science with Goethe, whose garden house you see there, and whose garden house is very clearly on the map and would in the end be actually related to the development of the Haus am Horn, or for that matter, the still presence through the sister of Nietzsche of the legacy of Nietzsche and the Nietzsche archive as it had been designed by Gropius's predecessor, Henry van der Velde. Here is your entry card, and it already shows us that the exhibition was a citywide affair. So also the very interesting, and this would be, I think, an interesting thing to look at, the history of schools designing exhibitions, in which exhibition design, and thinking about the relationship of exhibitions to public relations, to the reaching outside the walls of the school, but this activation of the entire town of Weimar for about 6 weeks. Of course, this could only happen. I put into the Noise Museum. Interesting things that kind of building up there. And then inside the great public buildings of Weimar had already been rather activated by the Dadaist in their encounter in 22, but it is again a major site for the exhibition in 23, along with the transformation of the Van der Velde building itself, so number 2 in den Gebäuden des staatlichen Bauhauses, and then finally the construction of a completely new building in the tradition of the exhibition house, at least back to the Great Exhibition of 1851. So catalog, but announces also the fact that Van der Velde's building is going to be transformed on the occasion of the exhibition, both ephemerally and permanently. So what should an exhibition of a school look like? How would you, in a certain sense, spatialize the curriculum? What is the relationship to showing the work of the students, to showing the work of the teachers? To this day, we have in architecture schools a famous person who teaches there, and there's an exhibition of their work. Does that make their work the product of Columbia University or of Yale University? So we have this whole issue of the private practice, and what are the boundaries between the private practice of the masters and the actual products of the workshops. And of course, the big problem was there was not yet anything from this central structure like Bauhaus, and in particular, it's not just for this kind of the idea of a building site, a construction site, as simultaneously an experiment and a demonstration. And of course, the workshops themselves were thrown open. It's a kind of open house day with various degrees of getting ready to receive the public. But most importantly, the building is famously itself made into an exhibition object, with the wall painting workshop transforming one of the staircases, secondary staircase there, but also the primary staircase. And most particularly, though in reality it was not finished for the 1923 exhibition, the transformation of Gropius's office. So we could say that one thing that happened at the Weimar Bauhaus, but completely under control of the masters, was the problem of how do you exhibit architecture is literally taken on, and we have practically the panorama of ways. You could make what is a up-to-date of-the-minute period room, and then get somebody to do an axonometric so that you can perceive its spatial subtlety in a different way. You can build a demonstration house, which is the Haus am Horn. This is a long tradition, and there are earlier examples of it even in Germany. Of course, it was be completely furnished by masters and students, so it was also a continuation of the workshops. And furnish it and stage it for photography, the famous kindergarten furniture here of Alma Buscher-Seedhoff. But the thing I really want to focus on for just a minute, because this is important too, and this is very much the take of an architectural historian, Gropius wanting architecture. Nobody has produced any architecture at the Bauhaus. We know from recent research that students who were interested in architecture were not getting an avant-garde training. They were going to the local technical school and actually getting technical instruction. But there is no student work whatsoever on display. The only work that comes out of the Bauhaus itself is done by people who are around Gropius, like Arkash Molnar, and these assistants who are working with Gropius on the idea of prefabrication through these demonstrations, the so-called Baukasting or building blocks. There are other work here that come from Gropius's private practice. This particular view does, there are only 2 known views of this exhibition. We know from the list what was there. The Haus am Horn is here in as a kind of a counterpoint to the red cube house that Gropius preferred. That Horn, of course, was designed by the painter Georg Mutter, so it is not actually a product of Bauhaus instruction per se. But this first bay is related at least to the debates and what was on the agenda for architecture internally to the Bauhaus, and in a ways a kind of premonition of what Gropius hoped would be a future curriculum centered around the class for experimental building site. However, as you can begin to see in peripheral vision, an enormous display of Dutch architecture. The show was dominated by contemporary production in the Netherlands. And JJP Oud would be one of the architects to come to attend the event and speak. So we begin to get a kind of, if you will, Weimar-Rotterdam axis. There was also a display, although it's not clear in the photographs, of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was much admired in Germany, but way back to Peter Behrens, as well as a display of Le Corbusier's work, which does not appear in photography, but recently have emerged, and I couldn't find them anywhere to steal for you off the internet. Le Corbusier himself didn't go, but he drew his drawings and the hanging plan for them, trying to control how he would be presented. But the main point is this little school that doesn't teach architecture has the hubris to present a show of what they called international architecture. You don't need to wait for Barr, Johnson, and Hitchcock to invent international style in 1932. It's already been invented in 1923, and the Bauhaus is seen as the central nexus point of it. So this is the beginning of that legend making in architecture. Since we discovered this here is Molnar's Bromley. So we have the whole issue of black and white photography and a Bauhaus house in bright red with a Bauhaus architectonic garden, if Molnar can be constituting a Bauhaus architecture. Here's some more of Gropius's ideas of not designing a final building, but designing a system for the production of housing and buildings. So that, I think, to be put, something we've already heard about, rather parallel to the whole drama of can ceramics be pushed into the world of production, serial conception, interchangeable parts, here with Theodor Bergdoll. One other photograph of that, and this is taken from history, and everything is a recording. There is the button for Siena, you can see side extract from the Bergdoll Exhibition in 1914, which was part of the display. And here you can see the way it is presented, memorialized in the Bauhaus album, the 8th International Architecture Exhibition. So that's what this is, the name of this little part. Here's a meeting with Kandinsky, Gropius, and Oud, JJP Oud, who really was very present in the exhibition. The most intriguing was this, which you encountered at the landing of the staircase on your way to see Gropius's office. So Gropius's office is a kind of real spatialization of international architecture, bringing together, this is truly cool, bringing together all of these ideas, Mies-van-der-Rohe, with the now lost model of the second great starting of 1922 and the concept of 23, facing off the Gropius. So this Gropius Mies thing is all the bullet because Gropius had rejected these from the exhibition of this is the beginning of this constant trying to solve it, but basically having a conflict that culminates really in the United States with this finally saying that even though he served as the second most private office's entry in American competition has to do with the Bauhaus. So this legend-making notion that all of these things are somehow related. Here's the story of the rejection. Mies had been rejected for this drawing. He changes his whole style in response and is admitted into the Bauhaus design in some ways infinitely more radical than Gropius himself and the concrete office building. This plate, original law, produced as a record of the exhibition. What did it actually happen in the exhibition? Who staged this photograph? What's the story? I think it's cut up from other photographs and made into this kind of photo montage of the various models composed into some kind of work of art themselves. What happens when the Bauhaus moves to the much more industrial city of Dessau, where the whole fabrication of its building and its occupancy in Dessau, again over very extended territory from the southern housing blocks at Dessau-Türten in the south of the city, through the buildings themselves and the masters' houses on the edge of the woods, will be staged as an outdoor architectural exhibition at the same time as an infrastructure for a whole new chapter in the school's life. There's something rather poignant about thinking that they were really camping out for the first year at various places in Dessau with 1 million addresses. To think that Gropius actually was only teaching in this school for just about 2 years. So it's very short-lived, this period that is so famous, one would have thought it had gone on for decades. Immediately we get these sorts of demonstrations of what's going on, the oft-reproduced postcard, but the fact that the Bauhaus is available immediately in postcards for the students and masters to send out these images worldwide about what is going on in Dessau. And of course, what is Bauhaus book number 1? Internationale Architektur. It is a remake of a much more extended version of what had already transpired in 1923. Of course, the Bauhaus building itself will be in the Bauhaus book number 1. There will be a subsequent Bauhaus book dedicated just to the building. This photograph that was commercially created by the Junkers photographic department was one that Gropius particularly loved because of the contrast with the pitched-roof houses in the back, but it also shows you that the building is at the edge of the developing center of Dessau. But when you begin to page through, here's some random pages. Le Corbusier, the same people again being appropriated, although Corbusier showed up this time for the Bauhaus Week, which was a kind of international gathering of people in December 25, even though there was not yet an architecture department at the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus's mastery of publications, the newspaper, the books that we've seen over and over again, the films, although the films were not made in-house, the famous film of life in the Gropius house, really this kind of propaganda machine. Now, happily, Dara has already done this work for me, so I'll skip very quickly over it, but I just want to point out something that I already tried to demonstrate in the MoMA catalog some years ago, which was in the years 1929 to early 31, that not even 2-year period, there were available 3 different exhibitions, each one done by a director of the Bauhaus, in which they claimed in one way or another to be showing off what the Bauhaus was. But if you were to go to them, you would get 3 radically different notions of what the Bauhaus was. The only one that was really officially about director, quite honestly, at the time that he was the director, is the one that Dara has talked to you about, Hannes Meyer's circulating exhibition that went to a whole host of European cities, spreading the word that everything that Gropius was telling you in the Bauhaus Bücher was the Bauhaus was not. There was something completely different going on in this foldable, practical furniture. And what a contrast to think if you went from, I'd have to look at the traveling schedule to see when it overlapped, probably from Basel to Paris. This exhibition, which to this day is referred to as a Bauhaus exhibition, it has nothing to do with the Bauhaus. It is an exhibition of the German Werkbund by invitation in Paris for an exhibition of decorative arts. staged inside the Grand Palais, so one of the great Beaux-Arts buildings. I would say emphatically that the Beaux-Arts was a much more influential school, still at that moment, than the Bauhaus had yet been. And the Gropius had left the Bauhaus, but there he and Herbert Bayer are displaying a model of the Bauhaus. Keep your eyes on that model. It's going to start a very long transatlantic life. It has a carbon footprint way beyond its workshops. And then, of course, this brilliant idea of hanging chairs for not only as works of art, but to represent serial production. Most curators don't ask for 4 copies of the same thing for exhibition purposes. So this absolutely brilliant exhibition design in which Bayer plays a very significant role there of one of Breuer's chairs. So I just wanted to contrast the aesthetic. At the same time, in Europe, Paris, which one is that? Is that Mannheim? I don't know. One of the stages of the dismountable. If you go to Dessau, the panel is hanging in the museum today. So some of these panels have survived. So as Dara said, it's brilliant because the exhibition concept of the packable panel is exactly the concept of the furniture itself. So as exhibition designers, and then a third, by 1931, Mies, who has been called to the Bauhaus, and the letzte Leiter really has been called to Dessau Bauhaus as the director, but he is also the curator-director of the Deutsche Bauhausstellung in 31 in the big exhibition hall in Berlin, creating this house, which is joined by a wall to a house by his collaborator and partner, Lily Ryan. And this too has often been interpreted as a Bauhaus event, even though it is a side activity of Mies, but it does really declare what is the model that the students are going to follow in trying to produce a Miesian architecture. But my point is simply to show you those 3 things. It's impossible that you could unify them together into an essential Bauhaus. And yet they are all almost on view at the same time. And this story continues. And so we could also say 1930 on the left, 1931 on the right. So after being at the Bauhaus, this fight for who had owned the Bauhaus. Who is going to write the history of the Bauhaus? Whose Bauhaus are we going to pay attention to? Is it Gropius putting the Bauhaus as the only 3-dimensional object in Bayer's notion of the kind of sensory around visual cone for an architectural display, in which he relates the Bauhaus to all sorts of other buildings from, because this is German Werkbund, from German modernism, some Gropius, some Mies, and other things there? Or is it, in fact, the exhibition mounted in 1931 in Moscow by Hannes Meyer, who had left with a group of left-leaning students, the so-called Bauhaus Red Brigade, in 1930 to Moscow, and by 1931 they had staged this exhibition, wonderful, with just the stools in the workspace and these photo panels which they had brought with them. And it is an exhibition on the Bauhaus between 1928 and 1930. So that's absolutely key as we turn to something that both Karen Kohler first and I have written about and others, which is the next stage, New York 1938, which will look at only 1919, 1928. So one tends to blame Gropius for omitting Meyer, but look what Meyer was doing in Moscow, way out of sight of his bougie friends who were about to travel off to Britain and Chicago. Now, America was not really so late in getting on the bandwagon because there were exhibitions of the Bauhaus during the time of the Bauhaus in the U.S. And I just really want to point that out. All the people who were involved, or the people who will later be in the ambit of MoMA, you might say, looking at the date here of the Harvard exhibition that was put on by the Society for Contemporary Art, which was largely a student-run organization. It's been very much written about. Exhibition in early 31 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Design Space, that they had much of it underwritten by Warburg, the son of the banker, curated by Lincoln Kirsten. Phil Johnson is involved, Barr is involved. So all of the personnel that we're going to re-meet at MoMA had already engaged a Bauhaus exhibition at Harvard. This was the very first one, and as Margaret Craig discovered many years ago, it actually came to a gallery in New York, although we have no visuals of what it looked like in New York. So by 31, there had been an exhibition in Bauhaus, but notice already the dates that are up there. It's not the Bauhaus, it's not current, it's the Bauhaus of Gropius' time that is being celebrated. So here are all the personnel who were going to make the MoMA exhibition, and they had all been at one point or another to the Bauhaus. Obviously, the young Barr is going to become director of the museum when it's founded in 1929. I think he was 28 years old. The young Philip Johnson, who will, in a sense, invent the Department of Architecture, and then Henry Russell Hitchcock, I think seen here at a MoMA opening. I think it might be the Bauhaus opening itself. So, how interesting if we read Russian, I don't, to compare this publication of 1931 in Moscow that accompanied Meyer's exhibition with the 1932 adoption of the international style. Much has been written on the transformation from international architecture to international style. So right there in 1932, in the immediate aftermath of these debates with Bauhaus trying to deal with the word style, you can pick up your latest issue of West 86 with the Dexel text on this, but that would be a very interesting thing to compare and contrast. Let's follow the model a little bit. Here it is with the skirt at the Museum of Modern Art in its temporary quarters at the 13th floor of the Heckscher, then called the Heckscher building. It was before it was all gilded up by Leona Helmsley. So you have to imagine going into that building, which is the latest Beaux-Arts skyscraper in New York, and getting off the elevator and seeing this. But this is the model that 2 years earlier had been in Paris. So it is, Philip Johnson doesn't look like such an exhibition designer when you put him next to Herbert Bayer, but there is that same model now traveling and performing a kind of different contextualization in this definition of the international style, but a whole room given over. This is not the Bauhaus room. This is the Walter Gropius room. But the Bauhaus is going to really begin to flourish in its post-mortem life at the Museum of Modern Art. So, of course, we have here of 35 the cover of Alfred Barr's Cubism and Abstract Art exhibition, one of a pair with his Dada and Surrealism show. This chart, which has been analyzed so often, I like to imagine that if you need to check your prescription and you're an art historian, you would go to the optometrist. What's the last line you can leave? Adjusted it all? No, I can see modern architecture. It's in a square, and it came into existence in 1925 out of the confluence of Purism, De Style, and Bauhaus, which is the true inheritor of Russian constructivism. There it is, solidified. Why 1925? That is the year of the construction of the Bauhaus building. So there you have it. We turn to the Museum of Modern Art guest book, where not everybody who attended, only people whose names were recognizable, signed in. But look at 1937, and we go down, we have Moholy-Nagy, we have Marcel Breuer, we have Herbert Bayer, always together, of course. We have Mies van der Rohe even coming in, and so it goes on. Clearly, the Bauhaus exhibition is being prepared, and for the Museum of Modern Art, briefly homeless, but offered a temporary headquarters by the Rockefeller family in their investment property of Rockefeller Center, where in the concourse leading to the subway, this now much documented exhibition is staged by Herbert Bayer. And the model, having gone back to Germany, been shipped to Cambridge, Massachusetts, is now having been, and Gropius writes these letters complaining, I have to keep repairing the thing, is sent to Rockefeller Center, where it's put in a shop window under the name Museum of Modern Art. So here is kind of the definitive association of Gropius's Bauhaus with the Museum of Modern Art. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into this in great length because both Karen Kohler some years ago and then me piggybacking on her have written and spent time on this exhibition and spent time in the archives on it and worked in particular at the justification of the exhibition being an exhibition 1919 to 1928. So it coincides with Gropius's Bauhaus. Meyer is not present. Mies is not present. Meyer, I don't think, was ever really even invited. Probably in this context, he was totally tainted by his time in the Soviet Union, although by now he was on his way to Mexico, but that was a little revolutionary too. And Mies didn't really want to be involved in any major way. Moholy-Nagy will be, from his outpost in Chicago. All of it is in preparation for moving into this building, which itself is going to be celebrated as Bauhaus architecture. Go figure. Just some immerse you in this world as if you were attending the opening. Here's your invitation, and you can see those dates: 1919, 1928. There is a letter in which Barr says, "I think it's okay. Everything that the Bauhaus had to accomplish was basically consolidated by 1928." So forget about what we've just seen over the course of the day. What interesting new experiments emerged under Meyer, and also a different approach to architecture under Mies. It was decided that everything had been consolidated by the day it was decided to leave. All that did is well enough for us last night. No reference whatsoever to politics, but just to remind you that this is quickly on the coattails of the exhibition of regenerate art. So interesting to put together these two museums, the place that will host degenerate art, the Haus der Deutschen Kunst, today Haus der Kunst, and the place that is being prepared for the Bauhaus. And for anybody else who's going to arrive in New York by airplane, but immediately know where to go, as they do to this day, from JFK. This is the letter that note that we found for a telegram with Philip Johnson saying, "I've seen this painting, the Nazis are closing Schlemmer's show. I'm going to buy it to show off the..." and this then enters Philip Johnson's collections, ultimately led to the Museum of Modern Art. So they're totally aware of what's going on politically, but that is not going to be absorbed in the show as the young John McAndrew, seen here at the Vassar College Art Library, who was the actual, ostensibly the curator of the show, but the real curators were Gropius and Meyer, and to a certain extent, Breuer, who lent his living room furniture from his house in Lincoln. So there's a little display which we just put up at MoMA. If you go on the way that the Museum of Modern Art's building figured into a debate on how you show modern art, and so this Bayer plan is hanging there now. I don't really want to get so much into the exhibition, but it was an attempt to show the curriculum of the Bauhaus. So it's not a show of the work of the masters and students. The student work that's shown is work of the preliminary course, but of course that doesn't exist any longer. This was largely created by other people, most particularly by Albers and students at Black Mountain College, reproduce the preliminary work things that could be in the show, highly didactic, and a demonstration of a lot of vintage, particularly decile material. So there's very little reference to the first couple of years of the Bauhaus. So even though it says 1919 to 1928, it is basically an exhibition of 1923 to 28, except, and this is what I want to insist on here, we're trying to get a kind of noise Zan view of it by an installation photographer there, trying to emulate this animation of what is largely reproduction material, and material that has been lent by various Bauhäusler. There's an amazingly fascinating campaign of writing in the archives, and you can note that very subtle changes of language, writing to people who were in Nazi Germany versus writing to people who were not. The letters to people who were in Germany say we're producing an exhibition about design. Those who are outside were producing an exhibition about the Bauhaus. But the key thing here I want to show you is not only, as you might expect, Gropius's non-Bauhaus work being once again put on display as though it was a product of the Bauhaus, but most key is to zero in on this little pedestal. This is a house under construction in Cohasset, Massachusetts, on the south shore of Boston, the Haggerty House for the parents of a student at the GSD by Gropius and Breuer. So, quite blatantly, is the notion that even if you use fieldstone, American siding, and the like, give the parents something that's a little bit related to the houses in Lincoln, that this is Bauhaus architecture in the New World. And there is this amazing moment once Gideon arrives, this is around the time that he's gearing up for the lectures that become Space-Time and Architecture, where he is essentially saying, I found the best equivalent for the word Zaklichkeit. We all do that all the time in lectures. If you want to know how to translate it into English, he got it, Yankee. So this is Yankee Bauhaus. And Breuer's furniture, which was made in Switzerland after he'd already left, juxtaposed with a current project. And moreover, we find the Laboratory School of Industrial Design, which is an extremely short-lived school in New York. It thought of itself as something of a successor to the principles of the preliminary course and the workshops. They were invited at the last minute. They put together this little display in about 2 weeks. And others are there as well, including representation from the new Bauhaus, although Gropius had a little bit of problems with Moholy-Nagy having taken over the name. But I also wanted you to see that just as the Bauhaus actually spent as many years in a Van de Velde building as it did in the Gropius building, that the short-lived new Bauhaus in Chicago moved into the Victorian mansion that was given to them by the Marshall Field family. And that moreover, the very idea of the Bauhaus in Chicago was a desire on the part of Chicago businessmen and industrialists, ultimately, to have the Bauhaus to their own ends. So a kind of complete flipping, where the Bauhaus is being sponsored by local industry, as opposed to trying desperately to make alliances with local industries, in Weimar in particular, in Dessau. There you see the American School of Design. So let me just finish by a few random observations about the subsequent development of this. The Gropius will work very intently with an existing institution, the Busch-Reisinger Museum, which dates back to the beginning of the 20th century as a place for collecting Germanic culture at Harvard, and thought for some time that this might be the appropriate repository for Bauhaus memory, particularly as thinking that his own activities in the Graduate School of Design at Harvard were a continuation of that. So here, interestingly, this exhibition from the 1950s on Bauhaus and art education in America. So this determination that the major legacy, at least in this version, is the pedagogical principles of the Bauhaus. But we're going to soon see that expand into architecture. Here is the model. What is it doing outside of MoMA? Barr wanted it for a permanent collection of architectural models that he wanted to create for students in New York, although there was a great deal of debate about that because it was not at the scale that had been established that would allow all of the buildings to be compared one to another. But Gropius took it back because by the 50s he feels that the Museum of Modern Art is not paying adequate attention to the Bauhaus. So we tend to think of the Museum of Modern Art as the steady drumbeat of Bauhaus support in America, but one of my students who I think is here today is working on looking at the kind of decline of the Bauhaus at the Museum of Modern Art. I think also it has a lot to do with something I'm not showing you, which is Philip Johnson's real hero was Mies van der Rohe. And Mies van der Rohe had a major retrospective, its first actual one-man show ever at the Museum of Modern Art in 1947. And the rivalry between Gropius and Mies, who increasingly wants to have an American career that is not built on the memory of the Bauhaus. I don't know about Mies's address book, but I don't think that he, like Gropius, kept a separate section for Bauhäusler. So it's really Gropius who is maintaining this network of former Bauhaus people and continuing both out of personal relations, but I think also out of continuing the memory. And the possession of this model is key. Let's follow the model to divided Germany. What is really key here are the projects. The art historian Winkler is key in this. The foundation of the Bauhaus Archive and the decision that in the post-war Federal Republic, some repository for memory of the Bauhaus might be necessary. And so we're going, and there's been much written about this, but I just want to introduce it into the story before we begin our discussions. But the complete parallel adoption of the Bauhaus by the Federal Republic and the German Democratic Republic, almost in response one to another, is completely fascinating. It's often said that the DDR is very slow on the uptake. This is absolutely not true. They respond almost in kind to much of what is happening in the West. So I showed you 1961, the construction of the hard wall. So here we are in the early 60s. And we're going to watch that model not only be transformed into cake form, but ultimately to be given not to the Busch-Reisinger Museum, but to the brand new Bauhaus Archive, which is projected initially for Darmstadt. We'll see in a moment. But here, contrasting the Bauhaus Archive, one of the last posthumous realizations of Walter Gropius, and arguably one of his most bad buildings. And here, issued in 1980, the final total rehabilitation once the Bauhaus enters into the DDR postal system with this stamp. But by then, the building has been restored dramatically. This begins with the placement of a plaque on the site of the where the temporary Bauhaus had been in Steglitz in the south of then West Berlin, because there are no visible traces whatsoever of the Bauhaus on the territory of West Berlin. So we see Bingler and Gropius. I don't know what he's drinking. This is not a cake. This is a model for the Gropius's design for a Bauhaus archive. The archive had been founded right around 1960 in Darmstadt, and interestingly enough, was originally housed in the Ernst Ludwig House on the Mathildenhohe. So that would have been really interesting too for this longer history, a sort of Pesnerian placement of the archives in that first German outdoor building exhibition, Darmstadt Dokument Deutsche Kunst, 1901. It was briefly there, and then Gropius designs this building for Darmstadt, which is going to house the things that he will give, but is also going to be another institution of what's going to become quickly a competing network of institutions seeking to identify former students and former teachers and obtain documentation and become the documentation center. So here is the project that the state was in 1964 for kind of almost those foothills there in Darmstadt, and that will be only lightly reworked to create this building, the final drawings of which are done by the successor firm, the Architects Collaborative of Boston, after Gropius's death in 1969. So this all corresponds with the, this has already also been evoked, the 50th anniversary of the Bauhaus. So exactly 50 years ago, believe it or not, in the explosion of exhibitions about the Bauhaus, there are not only centennial exhibitions, there is a 50th anniversary exhibition of the 50th anniversary. And so here you see it, 50 years. It's a Bauhaus, a 50-year anniversary. So now we've got exhibitions about exhibitions. There's the catalog, once again designed by Herbert Bayer. So that too is interesting. Herbert Bayer designing the exhibition in 1938. The Bauhaus has become something, I should flip back to that plan at MoMA with its wonderful play on surrealism, with its wonderful play on, there's a kind of playfulness about it. It seems almost delirious considering the world situation. But in 1968, he creates this modular system. Why this modular system, not only because it's starting to look like a very old school version of what the Bauhaus was, with this dropped ceiling. Now, admittedly, Gropius had made an early dropped ceiling in the Arbeitsamt in Dessau, a much more rationalistic vision of the Bauhaus. Of course, the model is back front and center, but the other reason that this is a modular situation is this is also a traveling exhibition, and the entire thing is paid for by the federal government, even though it starts and is very heavily organized by the Württemberg Gallery in Stuttgart, where it debuts. And I won't belabor this because Paul Betts already showed us last night the irony of the fact that Gropius, who has come over for this, he's now very elderly, has to have a confrontation with the students who are protesting the closure of the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, which had fancied itself the successor institution to the Bauhaus. We've already heard about that. So the irony that this exhibition gets taken up into the student protests, which are European-wide. So this is actually only days after the students occupy the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so the university uprising spreading into, Sorbonne had spread into the École des Beaux-Arts, and many other places, this spreading across higher education. And the irony was not lost on anyone that one school is being closed while the government is pouring money into this traveling exhibition. But almost exactly at the very same time, we have a traveling exhibition organized by the DDR with financing from the foreign ministry of the DDR about the Weimar Bauhaus, 1919-1925. Here you see a presentation in Helsinki that traveled to friendly nations, and particularly to the nations of the East, the so-called Bruderländer, or brother countries behind the Iron Curtain. So we have simultaneously an East German and a West German traveling exhibition with financing from the foreign ministry. And let me just conclude by looking at Gropius's house, because of course Gropius built two for himself. So they have often been compared, particularly in a wonderful book called Gropius baut privat. Gropius builds privately. Neither of them were on land that he owned. This is the director's house at the Bauhaus, later substantially remodeled by Mies van der Rohe, who did not want to live in Gropius' interior, but then bombed late in the war when Dessau was very heavily bombed. So this is the major loss among the master's houses in Dessau. This is the house that he built in 37-38 in land given to him by Helen Storrow in Lincoln, where a little revived Bauhaus colony will be created within a short walk from Walden Pond. So they would be interesting if this were an architectural history lesson to compare and contrast, but I'm more interested in their respective fates. So the last 10 years since we did the exhibition at MoMA has been accompanied by an enormous amount of historical research in preparation for the centennial in Weimar, of course, and in Dessau, both of which have opened new museums. But probably the most controversial debate was over what to do on the site of the lost Gropius house. And in the end, I just saw this for the first time myself a few days ago. This is not my photograph. Gropius's house, there was a competition, and the competition was as much a design competition as it was a museological competition, and a competition over the issue of memory. What should be commemorated on this site? Should it completely ignore the fact that for a half a century this site was in the German Democratic Republic? If you go today, all of the masters' houses, which had been completely transformed, almost unrecognizably in the DDR, going that way because they're further down the street, have been restored to their original form. So we have the whole issue of the reunited Germany removing the visible signs of the German Democratic Republic, but the decision that was made here ultimately was to build a ghost house. So this house is the exact volumetric reproduction of what was there in beautiful, kind of Swiss-like reinforced poured-in-place concrete. Has absolutely nothing to do with the technology of concrete available in Dessau in 1925 to 1930. And in its interior, as you can see here, is a architectural invention of the architects who, as a kind of empty memorial site, a kind of something between Rachel White Reed and the monument to the burnt books on Babelplatz, where there are empty shelves underground. To me, completely mystifying, neither fish nor fowl of memory, with no function whatsoever, except a ticket taker and male and female bathrooms in the basement. This is Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is staged in the tradition of the American House Museum, where correspondence is out. Gropius actually just went to teach and forgot to take his glasses. And his typewriter is there. Everything looks exactly as though Gropius had been there a few minutes earlier in the 1960s. So what a contrast between the fate of these two houses. So I just end with a picture of myself taken a few days ago with my colleague Dietrich Neumann, and because you are invited in the exhibition Original Bauhaus to stage the Erich Constantmüller photograph, I got the legs crossed in the wrong direction, sorry, and because they're trying to figure out who is actually behind that mask. There's a wonderful expose about that in this visitor engagement. But I took Dietrich's identity, so we continue, don't tell anyone, to continue to puzzle who is this later day Bauhaus figure here, and just using it in a joking way to say that perhaps in the end of the day, there are as many Bauhauses as we would like, and everybody finds their own Bauhaus. Thank you.